I think as far as reading is concerned, I do think a lot of people are influenced by what they enjoy as children. So, you know, if you grow up as a child reading a lot of comic books and fantasy, then that's probably a taste you'll carry through to adulthood. And if you're interested in history as a child, then historical novels are a way of getting perhaps a bit more richly inside that world that history, factual history, can make seem a little bit dry. So that's certainly where it started for me. I was always very interested in the Tudor period of history as a child. But this particular series that I do as S.J. Paris, that very much began with the character, the central character of Giordano Bruno, who I read about as a student when I was studying Renaissance literature and the various schools of thought that surrounded a lot of Elizabethan writing. And I came across mentions of this guy Bruno, who, because he was living in England in the 1580s, he was friends with people like Philip Sidney, so he and other members of Elizabeth's court. So he was sort of on the fringes of that Elizabethan intellectual circle. And what interested me about him was just all the contradictions that went on in his life and in his experience. And so for that reason, he always seemed to me to be a good subject for fiction. You know, he was an exile, he was a heretic, he was wanted by the Inquisition, he was seeking refuge in Elizabeth's England, but possibly also working as a spy against the French ambassador who was living here in London. And that, for me, really, that was the key to it, was this sort of possible double identity that he had. That if he really was working as a spy, that seemed to me the way into writing a series of books that might be a bit, I suppose, be a bit sort of more pacey and a bit more perhaps aimed towards that particular genre, or at least a crossover of those genres between crime, espionage and history. So I was interested in bringing those two genres together rather than just doing like a straight narrative life of him. Well, a bit of both. I think certainly at the beginning, I researched what I knew of his life as thoroughly as I could, given that I don't really speak Italian. So I was, you know, obviously there's a lot of source material that's out of reach to me, but there's a lot that's in English that's good, that I could sort of get to grips with the background of the historical character. And certainly in the first two novels, I did feel very closely tied to that. I felt I was bringing Bruno to life in fiction, and therefore I had a duty to kind of to stick to the facts and to stick to what was known about him. I think by the third and certainly now the fourth book, I've started to feel a bit more liberated, and I feel that the Bruno in my books has become more of his own person. He's a little bit more kind of dashing, I think, than perhaps the real guy was, although we do know that he was extremely charismatic, and he was a very desirable person to have around, partly because he was so outspoken, and therefore people liked having him at their dinner table because he would always cause a controversy and get people kind of animate the conversation. So and the first two books in the series, I stuck quite closely to what we know about where he was in a particular year. And in the third and the fourth, I took a bit more liberty with having him travel, because we've got a couple of years in England where we don't really know much about what he was doing. And so I've had him travel to places that he probably didn't go to, but you know, could have done. I haven't made it too implausible. But therefore, you know, then having given him an invented context and environment, I felt a bit more liberty, I think, now to let my Bruno develop into his own character. I think it certainly is becoming more and more blurred now, and in fact we were just discussing this on the panel, the idea that it's easier to sell something perhaps as a memoir because People like that stamp of authenticity, and I wonder if that it has to do with the rise of reality television and that sort of more confessional genre, that somehow we accord more value to something if we think the author really experienced it, and that's where we've got into some quite sticky territory, I think, with some authors passing off memoirs that were not necessarily true. But we're also seeing it in other areas. I mean, I write historical fiction now, and there is a debate going on about how much license a historical novelist has to invent the past, because we're living in an age when actually a lot of people are getting their history from TV adaptations or from novels. And if that's the case, how much responsibility does an author have to the facts? And my view is that actually, as long as you're sort of sticking vaguely to the correct dates, or pretty much, you know, you stay with the information that we've got. But as a novelist, if you choose to invent, actually that's your prerogative. If you're not trying to sell something as biography or straight history, you've got all the liberty in the world to invent if you choose to, as long as you're making very clear that it's made up. Again, it does get blurred because there's all kinds of sort of narrative histories now that are very popular, narrative biographies, where a biographer will by and large stick to the facts, but then imagine certain conversations that might have taken place, you know, even if they don't know what was actually said. And again, that's becoming very popular. So I think we are seeing a kind of merging of genres in a way, and people wanting to fill in those gaps, perhaps in factual knowledge with imagination. But I think we do need to be careful about how things are labelled, because in the end there has to be a distinction between you know, perhaps something that's actually happened and something that has been edited or adapted or embellished by an author's imagination, and that's really where journalism has to step in, or, you know, particularly if you're talking about contemporary events. Yes, and I suppose when we say the authorial voice, it can mean a number of different things. Do we mean that author's particular style? So, I mean, we mentioned earlier Hilary Mantel's, particularly her Cromwell books. You know, that to me is a voice, by which I mean a literary style, which feels so original and immediate and muscular. And that's what I love about those books, is that I think she's she's given historical fiction a kind of muscle and a heft that it has lacked. I felt, you know, I look back at previous historical fiction and it feels a bit bloodless next to those Cromwell novels. And that's partly because he is such a phenomenal character, the way that she's created him. But I think in large part it's to do with that very particular style that she has made her own through those books. And to me, that authorial voice is, you know, it's impossible to separate from the character himself, even though it's a third-person narrative. So, so there's that sense of the voice. And I suppose when I think of what an author's voice is, I think most particularly of their writing style and of their prose. But you know, I guess we can also mean that particular author's philosophy and viewpoint that they're bringing to the books. But I suppose what grabs readers immediately, in the end, it's the storytelling. It is the storytelling, and it's hard to. You can fall in love with an author's voice, but then if the story doesn't really develop, it's hard to sustain that affection for a particular style if there's a lack of plot behind it. I find, and that's why I find plot and story have become more important to me as I get older. I think maybe I was more tolerant of very experimental narrative when I was younger, when I was a student. And now I come back to, maybe it's to do with returning to a love for detective stories and crime fiction, which I sort of abandoned for many years out of a kind of misplaced literary snobbery. But I do find as I get older, I like a good story as well as a really arresting prose style, and that to me is part of the author's voice. Yes, I think it's entirely spurious, and I think it is quite a recent. It's quite a recent phenomenon. This slight snobbery towards fiction that does fall within, you know, what we might define as a particular genre. When you think, you know, Dickens wrote ghost stories, and you know, the idea that something like a ghost story or a horror story or something that's futuristic is in itself less of a valid subject and therefore less literary than something that is about, well, as Michael Chabon was saying earlier, divorce or adultery in a modern city. I think that sort of distinction seems to have crept in the 20th century, really, but I became very conscious of it, and I don't know whether it was particularly to do with studying literature, but all through my teens I loved crime fiction, and that's what I read for pleasure outside of my schoolwork. And when I came to apply to university, my teacher said to me, when they ask you what you like to read, for goodness sake, don't say you like to read Colin Dexter and P.D. James and Dorothy Sayers and Conan Doyle. That's, you know, well, I suppose Conan Doyle's acquired a kind of dignity simply with the passage of time. Because, again, he was somebody who actually was rather how can I put it? I suppose he disliked the fact that he'd become famous and made his living from these stories which he felt were not his best writing. So he, again, I suppose that degree of snobbery existed even for him. But yes, I was told, you know, don't say that you like crime fiction. And so for the whole, that was when I understood, really, that this is a type of writing that isn't considered worth your attention, or it's lesser than, you know, somebody like Saul Bellow or A.S. Byatt, or people that will impress your interviewers. And that stuck with me for a long time. And even then, when I left, I did an English degree, and I went to work on the books pages of a broadsheet paper, which again gave very little space to crime fiction or to sci-fi or fantasy literature. These things were kind of slightly ghettoized, or, you know, done once a month in a roundup or something like that. And it took me a while to come back to that, and to understand that actually there can be some fantastically good writing within those genres. And I suppose the distinction, if you want to be really simplistic about it, there's a sort of realism versus escapism idea, which is what Mark Haddon touched on earlier, which is to say that genre fiction allows you to imagine that you're a spy or a captain of a spaceship or a medieval knight, or, you know, or fighting dragons or a hobbit or something like that. Whereas what we might define as literary fiction shows us lives that are more recognisably like our own, or like people we might know, and tries to sort of do something imaginative within the confines of reality. So I suppose that's the simplistic division, but actually I read an interview with George R.R. Martin recently where he said, he begins with, he quoted Faulkner saying, the only thing that's interesting, the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. And actually you can do that in a castle with dragons, or you can do it, you know, in a small flat in Hampstead with people, a couple separating, or, you know, there's a way to look at those, you know, that human drama in any genre, really, and that's what the quality should be. I was quite anti the idea of ebooks to start with, and I still don't own a Kindle just as a matter of principle. I like a book. I like to have a physical book. I like to fold down pages when something interests me. I like to make pencil marks on it. I don't really enjoy reading on a screen unless I absolutely have to. So I'm not an ebook buyer. I'm conscious that a lot of my readers are, and I think particularly with something like crime fiction, it's a genre that does, or it's a type of book, let's say, that lends itself very well to ebooks because people read a crime novel very quickly and they don't tend to go back to it. You know, once you've found out the ending to a crime novel, you know, unless it's very special, you're unlikely to go back and reread and reread. It's not, that doesn't happen. So those sort of books tend to be a bit more disposable, I guess. So I understand completely the attraction of downloading something, reading it in a few days, and then clearing it away to make space for the next one. I love bookshops, though. I really love bookshops. I love browsing. I love wandering around bookshops. I used to love taking my son into bookshops when he was small to take things off the shelves and choose. And I can't bear the thought of a world where bookshops have died out and we just browse on screens and get our books recommended by algorithms. And so for that reason, I have to say I hope that ebooks don't ever replace books, because I hate the thought of libraries and bookshops not existing anymore.